Joining me now is Ken Klippenstein, our senior investigative reporter, otherwise known as Kenny Clips. Ken, you're aware of your fame now as a comic book hero?
Along with the Krasensteins as well. So I had to join in there, yeah.
You know, you're also getting a little bit of a Ken Bone thing going on here, no disrespect, but you had the lavender sweater vest and now you got the red one going on like Ken did. You're in the middle of the country, no wonder you're in an undisclosed bunker. I mean, there are things happening, they just are. One of the things that's happening is you were featured, one of your stories was featured in Congress. So I want to play this clip for folks. This is Representative Cedric Richmond talking about a story that you broke, and then I want you to come back and explain to us what that story was. Let's watch first.
An August 8, 2019 article by the Young Turks entitled Leaked FBI Documents Reveal Bureau's Priorities Under Trump. We're alerted about something called Iron Fist. Is that an ongoing, does it exist, one? And two, is it still ongoing? And our information tells us it was to target individuals it classified as black identity as extremists.
Well, I'm not familiar with the name that you just used, so I can't engage specifically on that question.
So later, Representative Richmond asked him to get more information and come back to them. So what do you make of that, Ken?
I would guess that he doesn't know, or that he does know what Iron Fist is, because it's one of the programs under their FBI priorities list, which was leaked to me and which we subsequently published. And that priorities list determines not just ideologically what their priorities are, but also where the resources are going to go towards. And within the priorities, one of the top programs listed was Iron Fist, as he mentioned, which was not just to monitor and surveil so-called black identity extremists, but even to recruit informants from within these so-called groups. So I would be surprised if the director of the FBI didn't know about that, and if he doesn't, that also doesn't speak well of him, because he should.
So you got this from internal documents, so we know with great certainty that that program does in fact exist.
Absolutely, and the congressman does too. I imagine he's just trying to get the director on the record.
Right, and so let's talk about the program. Let's give a little bit of background and history here for the folks who aren't familiar with it. We did cover it earlier in the show when you broke the story originally, but for people who don't know, what do they mean black identity extremists? And then how does Iron Fist fit into that?
What's particularly concerning about this designation is not necessarily that they're targeting extremists, but the way that they go about defining it. And if you look at the, we published the FBI priorities list, but then also the definition of each of those priorities. And the way they define that was kind of radicals arising from discontent with treatment of black individuals within the country, and then it actually specifically mentions the Ferguson protests, which I thought was very alarming.
So is that part of the original tracking of black identity extremists that you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay, so what do they do with the Ferguson protests, for example? What does it mean to track people, and are they tracking all the Ferguson protesters in case there's an extremist in there? Do they have intel that there in fact is a splinter group of extremists? I don't know that you know all of that, but I'm curious as to what they think that they're tracking.
Well, given that these are policy memoranda that we were able to obtain, it sort of describes their overall strategy, but it doesn't get into very granular detail beyond saying that they're recruiting informants within these groups, noting that it's been difficult for them to recruit informants, which implies that they have some familiarity with this process and that this isn't necessarily something that, at the time of the publication was just, speculation. It seems like they're actually actively doing it, and they've drawn conclusions from it. But what was shocking is that they also describe, general discontent and separatist groups, things like that, that could be construed very broadly, and not necessarily, say you're targeting a militant group like Al Qaeda or something like that. The things that they describe are not necessarily operationally coordinated or defined groups, and that just, I think, invites mission creep in the sense that that this can be broadly applied to many different groups.
Yeah. So in fact, first of all, I like that the Ferguson protesters are apparently too strong to break and hard to get informants in that situation. And there's nothing to break. They're just protesters. One of the leaders of the Ferguson protests is Cori Bush. She's now running for Congress. So they might have actually been targeting people who might one day be in Congress. So look, they're from the outside, Ken, let me put it this way. They look like they're in search of a problem that doesn't necessarily exist. Is there a widespread domestic terrorism happening from black identity extremists that I'm unaware of?
What's interesting is if you look at the documents, when they describe another one of the threats, white supremacists, they're able to cite, a bunch of different examples of not just illegal activity, but ones that resulted in deaths and in some cases large numbers of deaths. And in the case of so-called black identity extremists, as I recall, they don't cite a single example of it. Certainly far fewer than the white supremacists. And if my recollection is correct, they don't cite a single example of a death resulting from this group.
Okay, and so all right, yeah, we don't see it in the news almost ever, and it turns out no, there isn't anything really much internally that they know that we don't know, but nonetheless, they decided just in case they'll target black groups doing the most patriotic thing you could do, which is looking for a redress of grievances from your government and exercising your freedom of speech. And so this is concerning. Is it part of the issue here, Ken, that they view groups that are on the left, including African-American groups, as more of a threat to the system, that instinctually the FBI looks at it that way, as opposed to groups on the right, which they feel like, oh, well, that's normal, that's just part of America?
From sources inside the Bureau, what they're telling me is that there was enormous pressure to try to create a sort of false equivalency, not even necessarily from a cynical perspective, although that may have come from the administration, but also given that they've had to kind of ramp up their efforts against white supremacists, this attitude that, we've got to apply this across the board so it doesn't look like we're being unfair to any particular ethnic group. The folks inside the Bureau I've known to be, pretty admirably objective. But when problems arise is when you've got pressures from the politicals at the top of it, appointees from the administration and then the administration itself. So I think there was an effort to try to conflate the threat of various groups as they've had to sort of increase their response to white nationalists.
So they did get criticism for this idea of black identity extremists earlier. So it looks like in the story that you uncovered that they rolled it into this catch bag basically of all extremists. And that's the thing called Iron Fist, if I understand it right. And that could be part of, well, look, I'm looking at right wing and white extremists, and they're the ones doing all these killings and deaths and attacks, etc. But I don't want right wingers to get upset at me, so I'm going to cover myself politically by also looking into black identity extremists, honestly, whether they exist or don't really exist, or if they're anywhere near the level of threat that the right wing extremists are.
Yeah, no, I think that's a completely reasonable supposition, and also that's what I'm hearing from the inside too.
Right, and so now that congressmen have seen your story and are asking the FBI director about it, what could be some possible ramifications of that going forward?
What's interesting about this story is that I know a lot of people inside the Bureau that were unhappy with how this was carried out, and I can't get into too much specifics because I have to protect sources, but there's a great desire to have more resources to meet the threat of white supremacist groups, and it's not necessarily that they're being roadblocked, but they're having to change their posture so much that they can't really keep up with it, and so I think a consequence of that is that it would really help if Congress is able to bear on them, because they really have the power of the purse strings, and then also can make it easier to change the nature of the funding away from these sort of militant groups like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State, and moving it towards what we're really facing, which is all these lone wolf attacks, many sort of white supremacist in character, and I'm hearing a lot of sort of indications from folks in Congress that I know, staffers and so on, that is something that, in part because of the story, they're bearing down on, and I'm really appreciative of that, because that was really the reason I wrote the story.
Right, and so I want people to understand. Last thing here, that it's not just that they're unnecessarily looking into African American protest groups and not only wasting resources, but perhaps violating their rights. But they're also misdirecting resources that could go to real threats. And if you have the resources in the right place, you might save some lives, right, Ken?
Absolutely, and again, this is what I'm hearing from lots of folks, not just in the bureau, but in federal law enforcement generally. This is not some far left position to want to provide them with resources, because this is what the technocrats and the experts that actually do this stuff are saying as well. It's just that the political will doesn't yet exist, but there does seem to be growing pressure.
All right, so everybody check out tyt.com/investigates, where you'll see Ken's stories, Jonathan Larson's stories, and including the last one that Ken broke about how the military has been given the order to be able to use lethal force inside the country. That appears to be a violation of the law, and so it's another important document that Ken wound up getting his hands on. So please check that out. Amazing stories that Ken breaks on a regular basis. So thanks for joining us, Ken. I appreciate it.
Hey, great to be with you, Cenk. Thanks.
2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below, then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.